In the last video, I discussed the subject of research, mostly in general terms. This especially focused on the necessary steps to getting your research done, namely, 1. Developing a good research question. For role-playing games, that includes such questions as, what can I do to turn this, whatever this is, into a setting? And what can I do to use this set of ideas in my game? And even more importantly, what major themes do I want to introduce into my game? What sort of tone do I want to adopt? As part of this line of questioning, of course, you're also going to have to ask an even more fundamental question. What game system am I going to use? This will be the subject of the very next video after this one, but it's a question you should start to consider. 2. Gathering research data, or the passive part of researching, where you're not really looking for anything specific necessarily, just getting basic information together. 3. Sifting, where you finally started to get enough of an understanding of your material that you can start recognizing what you do and don't want to include in your game. In other words, this is where you begin breaking down the bits and pieces of all that data you've been accumulating so that they're now in discrete units, which leads to 4. Refining, where you take what you've sifted out and start to work it down even further until you have the core essence of each idea unit and can now make use of them either in their most fundamental state or else as is, but adjusted so that they look more unique than they really are. And 5. Organizing, the final step, where you take all that stuff you've gathered and refined and then put it into a format with a beginning, middle, and end, tailoring it to the exact length of time that you've got available, whether it be a single game session of 3 to 4 hours, such as at a conference, or just to introduce some new players to role-playing games, or to develop a full-size campaign that might go on for literally years. Now that I've presented how to do research, I'm going to give you an example. And for that example, I'm going to start at the very beginning and work myself through the entire process, start to finish. In episode 2, I drew on the old arcade game Berserk as my starting point for demonstrating turning something into an inspiration. After the trauma I suffered, I'm not doing that again. So, instead, let's say that, just for fun, and to try and overcome the trauma I suffered from remembering Evil Otto, I've been replaying one of my favorite games of all times, Super Mario RPG. Before you ask, yes, I own it on an original system, and no, you can't have it. Or the system. They're mine. But back to our topic. As I was playing that game, I started to think to myself, our fundamental question. How can I turn this into a tabletop role-playing game? Just like that, I've taken the first big necessary step into the great unknown. But because I know what to do next, I'm not overwhelmed. Instead, I break down my next necessary steps and get down to the work of researching a proper solution to this problem. Surprisingly, after I started the process of seriously considering how to turn Super Mario RPG into a tabletop game, I discovered that I'd already done most of the work of gathering research data. I'm an 80s kid, and so I'd grown up on Mario Brothers games back from the days of the original Atari 2600, which Dad liked to use for playing the pinball game Midnight Magic, saving up my own money from various chores I did around the house and for other people in our neighborhood, mowing lawns and raking leaves, and then finally, with a burst of birthday money to top me off, I finally scraped together enough cash to buy the first ever video game I could say that was mine, Mario Brothers. The original home version of Mario Brothers, no super attached yet. These guys were carpenters, not plumbers, and they were doing battle against all sorts of weird critters that were swarming out of the pipes in their workplace, a building that got steadily more unreal the further in they got, and more dangerous as well. ever since I've been unconsciously doing research on the entire game series, so that whole collecting of research is pretty close to done before I even got started. Add in today's internet with whole fan sites dedicated to the Mario Brothers games, to the Smash Brothers franchise, and to various Nintendo games in general, and collecting information is the easy part. The hard part is figuring out what to do with it all. Reminiscences aside, and not letting ourselves get overwhelmed by too much information, for a fun night of gaming with a one-shot adventure, we can just boil down the plot of the good old Nintendo game, packaged along with Duck Hunt in most Nintendo Entertainment Systems during the 1980s. It's a really standard plot, actually, as basic as they come. An evil warlord has dominated a realm, and so it's up to the heroes, the player characters, to rush to the rescue. With that starting point, we'll assume that we've got about, 4 hours of time to fill up, that being a pretty good period of play, enough so that everyone can meet at your place at about 6 or so on a Friday, play until 10, and then have the rest of the weekend for their other activities. Since we've got a definite time limit there, let's base our story around each of the hours, which means we'll have 4 big plot points in our story. Right away, we've limited ourselves down to doing the research we need, and can actually skip most of the rest of the process of research, jumping straight to turning what we've got into a 4-hour fantasy romp and Goomba stomp. The first hour will be for getting settled in, enjoying small talk, establishing backstory, getting everybody familiar with their characters for the evening, which, for a short quest like this, should be made in advance, and otherwise getting them pointed in the right direction. Since this is such a short game, there shouldn't be much need for serious depth or player motivations. They are there to save the realm from the evil overbaddie, and they've got their heroes all statted out and ready to go for an evening's fun. No major plot twists necessary. Thank you very much, and hence no major need for heavy research outside of our initial source material. Once we've had the heroes get their talk on with any essential plot presentation NPCs, then we can let them go into the second hour, which will mostly be fighting their way through 1 or 2 lesser encounters, maybe dealing with 1 or 2 natural hazards, herds of the land, or traps set in their path, and otherwise making their way to the lair of the final badnassery. In the process, the heroes should be presented with opportunities to save innocent victims from the bad guys, or at least to see some of the bad guys' activities in aftermath, so they can better understand that they're the good guys here, and what they're fighting against. On the way, probably right before the gates, they'll encounter a mid-boss, the Hammer Brothers or Lakitu in the original game, and have to overcome these villains in some fashion. As I'll discuss in a future video, you should always do your best to plan out at least 3 possible ways that your players might defeat the challenges before them. And so, while the video game we're using as our source material might be pretty linear, at the table your players will have plenty of options available to them, not all of them limited to combat. Maybe the party beats up the bad guys, like in the game. Maybe they fast-talk their way past, claiming that they're mercenaries or wandering entertainers. Maybe they disguise themselves in Koopa shells they've swiped from one of their previous encounters, or the uniforms of other bad guys, if you don't want to use the source material verbatim. Maybe they decide to slip by quietly and enter a secret water pipe leading into the bad guy's lair. Whatever works. And there we are, into the 3rd hour. And we're in the lair of Doomington, whoever that might be. Naturally, King Bowser Koopa in the original boss bad guy, but if we're trying to at least pretend we're being original, it's not hard to swap him out with somebody equally appropriate. After all, wherever you go, dragons are dragons, and final bosses are final bosses. Where the outside was mostly about encounters with baddies, showing off how rotten the jerks are, and how they're wrecking the place, and how the player characters are totally justified in defeating them, the interior is now mostly about overcoming puzzles, pitfalls, and traps. In most role-playing games, this means skill rolls, spotting dangers, jumping pits, climbing walls to escape lava boiling up to fill the area behind them, dodging spinning spiked pillars, and so forth. Since this is a tabletop game, you can also slip in a few puzzles if that's your thing. Maybe riddles or even hunt the item backtracking a la Resident Evil. What you use exactly depends on what you and your players tend to like, or that you think they'll like, or what you just want to try out to see if you'll like. If you're ever at a loss, then you can break up the puzzles and pitfalls with a combat encounter or two, though you should make sure they're not too serious. You've only got an hour left after this, after all, and that kind of time can go really fast. Finally, we're at the last hour of the 4, and we're finally up against the big baddie boss guy. On guard, villain! Here, you should consider how much time you've got left. If you're running right on time, or somehow, I have no idea how you manage that, ahead of schedule, then you should probably have your boss accompanied by some minions, disposable cannon fodder, whose entire purpose in existing is to spread out some of the player characters' actions. That means that they'll need to be dangerous enough that the party can't ignore them, but weak enough that they can be overcome in, maybe 1 to 3 hits, give or take. On the other hand, if you're short on time, just have the boss appear, alone. Either way, the baddie can make his speech, maybe even toss out a "Join Me" challenge, or "We're not so different" spiel, or some other fun stuff from the Evil Overlord handbook. But only have the fella mean it if you, the game master, are really willing to let the campaign take a really weird turn for the dark. Otherwise, he's just stalling for time, which, by the way, is something to remember for later. Never make anything possible unless you're perfectly willing to follow through on all the consequences, even if that means scrapping an entire campaign and starting something completely new and different. Obviously, in the Super Mario Bros. Game that serves as our inspiration source, the final boss was a giant dragon turtle thing, and you can certainly use a dragon if you want. Dragons make great final bosses everywhere you go. On the other hand, you could fill in that role with a Lich, a wizard, an anti-paladin, an orc war boss, or just about anything else that strikes your fancy, and fits the flavor of the game, or is just the easiest thing you can pull up for play at the moment. The players face the bad guy, they win, and they get to enjoy a closing narrative from you, and showering with rewards. Or they lose, in which case you end by saying that the next group of freedom fighters will have to pick up where the players left off, which could segue nicely into another night of fun and games, or even into a full campaign based on the original setup for that one-shot. But what if we don't want to just run a one-shot? What if we want to turn our Super Mario-based experience into something more substantial? For that, we're going to have to start into the hard work of sifting, refining, and organizing. As we get to work on that, bear in mind, based on my prior experiences, a full campaign with story and backstory and lots of plot and everything should run for, about 2 to 3 years, give or take. That's been my experience in all prior campaigns that didn't outlive their natural lifespans, and I think it makes a good standard. So, we've got a lot more room in which to work than we did before, but not an unlimited amount, so we still need to impose a few limits. Now that we've decided that we're going to be setting up for a long-haul, multiple-year campaign, we've got our work cut out for us. Fortunately, we've also got plenty of source material, so much that Captain Lou Albano went through several seasons of a cartoon show based on it all. And even more fortunately, we don't actually have to change the starting premise. We've still got an evil overlord, and that nasty person has conquered a bunch of formerly peaceful realms, and the party of player characters are going to save it. Their specific motivations will vary, but they should all eventually be ready to accept that they're in the game for the end goal of saving the realm somehow. Maybe some of them are in fact do-gooder hero types. Maybe others are in it for revenge. Maybe others just realize that there's more profit to be had by being on the ground floor if and when the good guys suddenly win. Doesn't matter. That sort of stuff is fodder for another video. Since we're going to be running a longer game, though, we need to have an appropriately larger amount of setting to play with. Whether you decide to reskin most of this campaign setting to make it look normal, or whether you intend to reskin it the other way, making everything explicitly Super Mario themed, is entirely up to the preferences of your players and of yourself. Do what feels right. You might just start cold if it's your own game, or you might present your players with the what-if scenario if Mario and Luigi hadn't answered the call to action. Instead, the players' characters did. Let's go back to the source material for our game world then, as well as to its cosmology. For this, we'll need to do some research into all those sites that can be found with a simple Google search, and in the process of those searches, we discover that there's actually a lot of games in the Super Mario series. Not all of them are really suitable for our purposes, and many of them repeat the same general plots, so we don't have to spend too much time going over them all. Less if we've already played most of the games in the series, as I have, which was a major reason for my deciding to use Super Mario as my starting point. Since I was already familiar with the setting, I didn't have to work as hard getting my stuff together. Eventually, we finish our sifting process with brutal efficiency and decide on our core sources for the campaign world and its underlying story, which are as follows. First, the original Super Mario Bros. Game, mostly just as our starting point. We've got a bad guy who turns his enemies to stone so that he doesn't have to kill them, but can instead thaw them out as he's ready to subjugate them properly. He's got a few mid-boss types around in the form of the Hammer Brothers, who are frontline fighters, and Lakitu, who's a sneaky summoner and sniper caster. Super Mario Bros. 2 will be our second source, or Yumi Kojo, Doki Doki Panic, for those purists out there. And I don't know how to pronounce Japanese, so that's the best I can do. This is important because it introduces the idea of a party of heroes, rather than just a pair of frontline fighters handling all the heavy lifting. There's also Fanto, and he's about as freaky as it comes if you need a villain to creep out your players. The game also introduces the idea that there are multiple worlds out there, all of them interconnected, and all of them having interesting, varied terrain. In this game's case, it's a dream world, but even so, it's as real as any. Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World will also be included, with perhaps some Super Mario World 2 if you're feeling dangerous. Together, these are where the game series really hit their peak, in my opinion, taking all the old tropes and really bringing them together. We also introduce a wider world with multiple islands and multiple different species, including several that are friendly, such as the Yoshis. Perhaps most importantly, we introduce the Koopa Kids, which in the games are Bowser's offspring, but for our purposes can be turned into various flavors of boss, the underlings of the big boss. I mean, we've got an acrobatic jester, a nerdy type, a mad composer, a spoiled girl who loves frilly things and throwing around copious blasts of magic to get her way, and more. Plenty of cool and useful concepts for you to use, play around with, and customize to your specific needs. We've also got more variant mid-bosses, such as variants on the Hammer Brothers, like the Boomerang Brothers and the Sumo Brothers, just to name two, opening up the idea of more gradual transitions in power levels, rather than just racing up against the final boss right away. Super Mario RPG will be our final inspiration. In this game, we get the cosmology of the setting, an even bigger world, plenty of new and interesting characters to encounter in various capacities, both as helps and hindrances, and the opportunity to build an actual role-playing party of a more traditional sort, composed of a wide variety of cool concepts. Using Super Mario RPG actually means that our player characters can be, pretty much anything they can think of. This game gives official permission to the players to make up any character type their creative energies can produce. And just like that, we've got our research together, and we're ready to start building our world. After some thought, we decide that this game will be a what-if scenario, the Super Mario universe played straight, but with the player characters as the protagonists, with a lot more options for solving problems available to them, besides just jumping on the heads of their enemies. By doing some digging into all of that source material I've just listed off, and then cracking them open, we can extract a few core concepts about the Super Mario universe, which we can then shuffle back together to make a basic campaign setup. First, there's the Star Road, which serves as the game's higher plane, where kindly beings made of star stuff collect and then eventually answer all the good wishes of people in all of the worlds. In Pathfinder or Dungeons & Dragons terms, this is where good clerics and similar classes get their powers. It's also where a lot of magic comes from for general use, usually the kind that isn't evil in nature. So we've got an ultimate good force, note the capital G and good, which provides some underlying justification to the good guys for what they're doing, without being so powerful that it makes the player characters irrelevant. This gentle force of good also explains why most people in the campaign setting are inclined to be peaceful and decent. They typically get their wishes answered, eventually, so long as they stay nice and work hard at their jobs, and their wishes are for normal, everyday things that make their lives better without hurting others, which makes for a great pastoral state that the player characters can easily identify as being a good thing that they'll want to save. These normal people also serve as a source of useful and helpful NPCs. I do recommend avoiding your princesses in another castle types as much as possible, though I don't blame you one bit if that line pops up at least once during the course of the game. But use NPCs who can give the player characters the support they need, even at great risk to themselves. The second point we learned from our research, the game world itself is actually a bunch of different worlds, a series of different planes of existence, each one of them worlds that are more or less flat and lumpy, sort of like the American Midwest, or like Earth, the Greyhawk campaign settings world, and all of them are connected by interdimensional portals. In the original games, these are pipes. This creates a layer cake of travel between worlds, usually making use of pipes as the universal transport system, which gives us plenty of opportunity to use all sorts of exotic settings and encounters that might otherwise be a lot harder to pull off in a more traditional globe-based campaign setting. This also gives us a great reason for why we can allow such a weird and wide variety of different character types for the players to encounter and also to use while making their own characters. If we want, we can even allow the players to customize their characters within the bounds of the rules, of course, to make them even more unique. For more on that, once again, I point you to Planescape, specifically Planescape Torment, which is kind of my go-to game for eclectic characters that stretch the boundaries of a traditional role-playing game. The third item that we learn in our various meanderings through research is, if there's an ultimate good, there's also an ultimate evil. We could dip deeper into Super Mario RPG for this, but it's not really necessary. We've already got an intercosmic world conqueror, and that nasty so-and-so is stomping all over the peaceful worlds, taking other people's stuff and generally being a real jerk. How dark you want to make this setup, ranging from death and gore at the deep end of the pool to cartoon violence on the lighter side, is one of those decisions you should make well before you actually start the game. But this campaign setup allows for just about anything within the range. The closer you are to the original source material, though, the more G-rated you should probably make this game, because doing awful things to establish characters in a child-friendly setting is just not cool. So, in our game, since we've decided to stay pretty close to the original source, whenever something gets killed, it's actually just bonked, rendered unconscious, knocked silly, turned into something else so it can't do anything, or otherwise taken out of play in a non-lethal fashion. We've got a lineup of various bad guys and mid-bosses to flesh out the middle ranks of this bad guy's forces, and these bad guys are all over the place, throwing up castles and dungeons and various obstacles. Besides the main baddies, Super Mario RPG also tosses out examples of a variety of unconnected bad guys, such as Booster, thieves and opportunistic power seekers, and misguided weirdos, see above, that can serve as a great starting point for making our own side quest characters, for those days when the players want to try out something different. Or you do. All of this nastiness also gives our heroes a great motivation. The reason for doing what they do is right there. With all of this material pulled together then, we're now ready to start the process of organizing our research, fleshing out where the player characters come from, and their motivations, their starting point, the various worlds, and the various challenges that will confront the party on their way through to the next world, and so on and so forth. All it took was deciding on a firm starting point. And now we can mix and match and switch things around as much as we like, because we have a really firm idea of where to go and how to get there. Once we've got our campaign started, our players should have a similar vision of where the campaign should go, and no matter what they eventually decide to do, even going completely off the rails of our nice, neat, save-the-world plotline, we won't ever have to panic, because we've laid all the groundwork, done all the research, and we're prepared with a fully fleshed-out world that can be adapted at need to whatever sort of story we, you and your players, might eventually decide needs to be told. Hopefully all of this was helpful to you and gave you a decent idea of what the process of researching for a role-playing game might look like, and perhaps even gave you a few ideas of how to get your own campaign started. If you found anything I've said interesting so far, please hit the like and possibly subscribe buttons as a way of encouraging me to keep up the work. And with all of that said, and all of that done, I wish you all the very best.